The morning of the ceremony dawned clear and bright over Edinburgh Castle. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the royal suite at the Balmoral Hotel, where Prince Louis sat at a small table eating breakfast with considerably more appetite than he had shown in days. Catherine watched her son with relief and pride as he chatted animatedly about the Scottish porridge he was eating and asked questions about the different tartans worn by the honor guard they had met the previous evening. The transformation from the distressed child on the train to this confident young prince was remarkable. "The oats taste different here," Louis observed, taking another spoonful. "More nutty, I think." "That's because they're grown in the Scottish Highlands," William explained. "The climate here gives them a unique flavor." Outside their window, Edinburgh Castle dominated the skyline, its ancient stones glowing golden in the morning light. The sight that had terrified Louis just yesterday now filled him with excitement about participating in the historical ceremony that would take place within those walls. Inspector Matthews arrived for the morning briefing, pleased to see the young prince in such good spirits. The security arrangements for the ceremony were comprehensive but had been adjusted to accommodate the emotional needs of an 8-year-old participant. "Your Highness," she said to Louis, "would you like to know about some of the special arrangements we've made for today?" Louis looked up from his breakfast with interest. "What kind of arrangements?" "Well, we've positioned family liaison officers at several points along your ceremonial route, so if you need anything at all, there will always be someone nearby who can help." This information seemed to further boost Louis's confidence. Knowing that support systems were in place specifically for him made the ceremony feel less daunting and more like a team effort. Lady Margaret Thornton joined them with the final schedule and some unexpected news that would make the day even more special for Louis. "Your Highness," she said with a smile, "the Lord Chamberlain has arranged for you to meet some of the young Scottish cadets who will be participating in today's ceremony. They're about your age and have been practicing just as hard as you have." Louis's eyes lit up at this prospect. The idea of meeting other children who would be part of the ceremony made him feel less alone in his role and more like part of a larger group effort. "When can I meet them?" he asked eagerly. "They'll be at the castle when we arrive for the morning rehearsal," Lady Margaret replied. "I think you'll find you have quite a lot in common with them." The morning rehearsal had been arranged to give Louis one final opportunity to practice his role in a low-pressure environment before the formal ceremony. This additional preparation time had been Catherine's suggestion after understanding how much her son's confidence had improved with practice. As they prepared to leave the hotel, Louis stood before the mirror while his valet helped him into his formal Highland dress. The traditional outfit included a small kilt in the royal tartan, a white dress shirt, and a formal jacket with silver buttons. "Do I look like a proper Scottish prince?" Louis asked, admiring his reflection. "You look absolutely perfect," Catherine assured him. "And, more importantly, you look like yourself." The journey to Edinburgh Castle took them through the historic Royal Mile, where crowds had already begun gathering along the route. But, instead of the faceless mass Louis had imagined in his fears, he could see individual families with children, elderly couples sharing folding chairs, and tourists with cameras who waved enthusiastically as the royal car passed. "Look, Mama," Louis pointed out excitedly. "That little boy is wearing a kilt just like mine." Indeed, many children in the crowd were dressed in their finest Scottish attire, turning the occasion into a celebration that included the whole community rather than just focusing on the royal family. At the castle entrance, the familiar sight of the honor guard was now welcoming rather than intimidating. Louis recognized several faces from their brief meeting the previous evening, and the guard smiled warmly as the royal family passed. Commander Harrison met them at the main gate with an update that added another positive element to the day. "Your Highnesses, the weather forecast remains perfect, and all participants are in position. The ceremony is proceeding exactly as planned." As they walked through the ancient courtyard where the ceremony would take place, Louis could see the careful preparations that had been made. A raised platform had been constructed for the formal elements, and seating areas were arranged to ensure that every guest would have a clear view of the proceedings. The young Scottish cadets who would participate alongside Louis were waiting in a designated area, and, as promised, they were close to his age and equally nervous about their roles in the ceremony. "Your Highness," said their leader, a 10-year-old girl named Fiona McPherson, We're honored to be part of today's ceremony with you." Lewis was impressed by her confidence and poise. "I'm glad you'll be there," he replied. "I've been a bit nervous about getting everything right." "We all have," admitted Jamie Stewart, a 9-year-old boy who would be carrying one of the ceremonial flags. "But our instructor told us that the most important thing is to remember why we're here." "Why are we here?" Lewis asked, genuinely curious about their perspective. "To honor our heritage and show respect for the traditions that connect us to our ancestors," Fiona explained. "And to represent all the young people of Scotland who care about preserving our culture." This explanation resonated deeply with Lewis. Understanding his role as part of a larger purpose, rather than as an individual performance, gave new meaning to everything he would do during the ceremony. The morning rehearsal proceeded smoothly, with Lewis and the young cadets practicing their entrance, positioning, and the key moments of the ceremony. The Lord Chamberlain, Sir Andrew MacLeod, proved to be patient and encouraging as he guided them through each element. "Remember," Sir Andrew told them, "this ceremony has been performed for hundreds of years. You are continuing a tradition that connects you to countless young people who have stood in this very spot and felt exactly the same mixture of honor and nervousness that you feel today." As they practiced the moment when Lewis would receive the ceremonial sword, he found that his hands remained steady and his voice was clear when he spoke the traditional words. The combination of preparation, support, and understanding had transformed his relationship with the ceremony entirely. During a break in the rehearsal, Lewis stood at one of the castle's ancient windows and looked out over Edinburgh. The view from the castle showed the city spread below, with the modern buildings mixing harmoniously with centuries-old architecture. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Catherine said, joining him at the window. "Yes," Lewis replied. "And it feels important. Like we're part of something much bigger than just ourselves." "That's exactly right," William agreed. "The ceremony today connects us to the past and helps ensure that these traditions continue into the future." As the time for the formal ceremony approached, guests began arriving at the castle. Lewis watched from a private room as dignitaries, officials, and invited members of the public took their seats in the courtyard. The sight that would have panicked him yesterday now filled him with anticipation. Inspector Matthews arrived with the final security briefing and some encouraging news. "Your Highness, everything is in perfect order. The guests are excited about today's ceremony, and there's a wonderful atmosphere of celebration throughout the castle." The young Scottish cadets joined the royal family in the preparation area, and Lewis was pleased to see that they seemed as ready and confident as he felt. Fiona had practiced her flag-bearing routine until it was flawless, and Jamie's sword presentation had improved dramatically since the morning rehearsal. "Are you ready for this?" Fiona asked Lewis as they prepared to make their entrance. "Yes, I really am," Lewis replied, surprised by how completely true those words felt. The ceremony began with the traditional fanfare of Scottish pipes and drums, filling the ancient courtyard with music that had echoed off these same stones for centuries. As the royal family and young participants made their entrance, the assembled crowd rose in respectful greeting. Lewis walked confidently beside his parents, his head held high and his steps steady. The crowd's applause was warm and encouraging, and he could see smiling faces throughout the assembled guests. The people watching him truly were there to celebrate and support, exactly as he had been told. When the moment came for Lewis to step forward and receive the ceremonial sword from the Lord Chamberlain, he moved with confidence and grace. His voice was clear and strong as he recited the traditional words that had been spoken by young members of the royal family for generations. "I, Lewis Arthur Charles of Cambridge, do solemnly promise to honor the traditions of Scotland and to carry forward the sacred bond between the royal house and the Scottish people in service and in truth." The words rang out across the courtyard with conviction and meaning. As Lewis spoke them, he understood fully what he was promising and why it mattered. This wasn't about performing perfectly for an audience. It was about making a genuine commitment to serve others and preserve important traditions. The ceremonial sword was heavier than he had expected, but his grip remained firm as he held it according to the ancient protocol. The weight of the sword seemed to symbolize the weight of responsibility he was accepting, but it felt manageable and appropriate rather than overwhelming. When the young Scottish cadets performed their roles, Lewis felt proud to be part of their group effort. Fiona's flag presentation was flawless, and Jamie's ceremonial march drew appreciative murmurs from the crowd. They were all succeeding together, supporting each other through their shared commitment to the ceremony. The moment that had worried Lewis most, when he would need to walk alone across the courtyard to return the sword to its ceremonial position, went smoothly and confidently. Each step felt purposeful, and the silence of the crowd felt respectful rather than judgmental. As the ceremony concluded with the final fanfare, and the gathered crowd rose for the closing honors, Lewis felt a profound sense of accomplishment and belonging. He had not only completed his role successfully, but had genuinely enjoyed participating in the ancient tradition. During the reception that followed, Lewis found himself comfortable greeting guests and accepting their congratulations on his performance. The interactions that had seemed so intimidating in his imagination were actually pleasant conversations with interesting people who shared his appreciation for Scottish heritage and royal traditions. One elderly gentleman, a historian who had attended similar ceremonies for over 50 years, made a particular impression on Lewis. "Your Highness," he said warmly, "that was one of the finest performances of this ceremony that I have ever witnessed. Your sincerity and respect for the tradition came through in every word and gesture." This praise meant even more to Lewis because it focused on the substance of his participation rather than just his technical accuracy. He had succeeded not just in remembering his lines and hitting his marks, but in genuinely honoring the meaning of the ceremony. As the royal family prepared to leave Edinburgh Castle, Lewis took one last look at the courtyard where the ceremony had taken place. The space that had seemed so intimidating in his fears now held happy memories of success and achievement. "Papa," he said as they walked toward their car, "could I participate in more ceremonies like this?" William smiled at his son's newfound enthusiasm for royal duties. "There will be many opportunities as you grow older, Lewis. Today showed that you have the character and commitment to handle them beautifully." The journey back to the train station took them once again through crowds of well-wishers, but Lewis now waved enthusiastically at the people lining the route. Their cheers and applause felt like genuine celebration of what had been accomplished rather than pressure for what was expected. Inspector Matthews, observing the complete transformation in the young prince's demeanor, felt satisfaction in how the challenging situation had been resolved. The family's wisdom in addressing Lewis's fears directly and the additional support systems that had been put in place had turned what could have been a disaster into a triumph. At Waverley Station, the same officials who had waited patiently for the royal family's emergence the day before now gathered to bid them farewell. Sir Robert MacLeod expressed the gratitude of the Scottish people for the family's participation in the ceremony. "Your Highnesses," he said, "today's ceremony will be remembered as a particularly meaningful celebration of the bonds between Scotland and the royal family." Prince Louis's participation was exemplary. As they boarded the royal train for the journey home, Louis was excited rather than anxious. The train that had carried him toward his fears now carried him away with new confidence and understanding of his role in the royal family. During the journey home, Louis talked enthusiastically about the ceremony, the friends he had made among the Scottish cadets, and his desire to learn more about Scottish history and traditions. The crisis that had threatened to overwhelm him had instead become a foundation for growth and confidence. Catherine and William exchanged satisfied glances as they listened to their son's animated discussion of the day's events. The wisdom they had shown in addressing his fears directly, rather than dismissing them, had not only prevented a potential crisis but had helped Louis develop resilience and understanding that would serve him well in future royal duties. As the train carried them through the Scottish countryside toward home, the royal family was united not just by successful completion of their official duties, but by the shared experience of facing and overcoming challenges together. Louis had learned that fears could be conquered, that support was always available, and that meaningful participation in important traditions was both a privilege and a joy. The boy who had hidden in the train's washroom, overwhelmed by anxiety about royal expectations, had been transformed into a confident young prince who understood his role and embraced it willingly. The ceremony that had seemed like an insurmountable challenge had become a celebration of heritage, family, and personal growth. Inspector Matthews noted in her final report that the incident had been resolved through exemplary family support and careful attention to the emotional needs of a young royal. The experience would undoubtedly inform future protocols for helping royal children navigate the pressures of public duty. As Edinburgh Castle disappeared behind them, and the train headed south toward home, Louis sat contentedly with his parents, already planning questions he wanted to ask about future ceremonies and traditions he might participate in. The fear that had nearly overwhelmed him had been replaced by eager anticipation for the next opportunity to serve his country and honor his heritage. The platform at Edinburgh Waverley Station buzzed with controlled activity as officials waited for the royal family to disembark. A red carpet had been rolled out precisely, and Scottish dignitaries stood in formation, ready to greet their royal guests. The Lord Lieutenant of Edinburgh checked his pocket watch, noting that the usual prompt royal emergence had not yet occurred. Inside the train, Catherine held Louis close, while William spoke quietly with Commander Harrison about delaying the official welcome ceremony. The young prince's emotional breakdown had revealed the depth of his distress about the upcoming formal obligations, and his parents knew that rushing into public appearances would only worsen his anxiety. "We need to give him time," Catherine whispered to her husband. "He's not ready to face the crowds right now." Inspector Matthews remained nearby, having witnessed the family's private moment of crisis. Her protective instincts extended beyond physical security to emotional welfare, especially when it concerned the young royals under her care. Louis gradually calmed in his mother's arms, though his breathing remained unsteady. The train's stillness felt strange after hours of constant movement, and the silence from outside emphasized how many people were waiting for them to appear. "Everyone's expecting us, aren't they?" Louis asked quietly, his voice muffled against Catherine's shoulder. "They can wait," William said firmly. "Right now, the only thing that matters is making sure you're okay." Through the window, Louis could see the edge of the waiting crowd and the distinctive uniforms of the honor guard. The sight made his stomach clench again, reminding him of tomorrow's ceremony, where he would be the center of even more attention. Commander Harrison approached the family with careful deference. "Your Royal Highnesses, the Lord Lieutenant is prepared to adjust the schedule as needed. We can delay the platform ceremony or modify it to reduce formality." Catherine looked gratefully at the experienced security chief. His understanding of the situation and willingness to prioritize Louis's well-being over protocol was exactly what they needed. "Thank you, Commander," she replied. "I think we need a few more minutes before Prince Louis is ready for any public appearances." Outside, the assembled officials began to murmur quietly among themselves as the delay stretched beyond the usual few minutes needed for final preparations. The Lord Lieutenant, Sir Robert MacLeod, was experienced enough in royal protocol to understand that delays usually indicated some form of difficulty. Lady Margaret Thornton appeared at the carriage entrance, having coordinated with the platform officials about the situation. Her diplomatic skills had proven invaluable over the years in managing the complex balance between royal family needs and public expectations. "The officials understand there's been a slight delay," she reported quietly. "They're prepared to wait as long as necessary." Louis looked up at the mention of the waiting officials, and fresh tears began to form in his eyes. "They're all waiting because of me," he whispered. "They're waiting because they care about you," William corrected gently. "And because they understand that sometimes even princes need a moment to collect themselves." The concept that others might understand his fears seemed to surprise Louis. In his young mind, he had imagined that everyone expected him to be brave and perfect all the time, without ever feeling scared or uncertain. Inspector Matthews, observing the family dynamics, remembered her own daughter's struggles with school performances and the pressure children felt to meet adult expectations. The parallels between ordinary childhood fears and royal obligations were more similar than many people realized. "Your Highness," she said quietly to Louis, "would it help to know that even the guards sometimes get nervous before big ceremonies?" Louis turned toward her with curious eyes. Really, Matthews confirmed. "The first time I had to protect an important person, I was so nervous I barely slept the night before. But you know what helped?" "What?" Lewis asked, his interest momentarily overcoming his distress. Remembering that everyone there wanted me to succeed. Nobody was hoping I would fail or make mistakes. They were all on my side. This perspective seemed to resonate with the young prince. The idea that the crowds and officials might actually want him to succeed, rather than waiting for him to fail, was a revelation that began to shift his understanding of the situation. Catherine seized on this opening. Inspector Matthews is absolutely right, sweetheart. Everyone who will be at tomorrow's ceremony is there because they support our family and want to celebrate with us. But what if I forget my words or drop the sword? Lewis asked, voicing his specific fears for the first time. William smiled reassuringly. Then, we'll help you remember, or we'll pick up the sword together. These ceremonies are about tradition and respect, not about perfection. The concept that mistakes might be acceptable, even in formal royal ceremonies, was another revelation for Lewis. His young mind had constructed an impossibly high standard where any error would be catastrophic. Commander Harrison, listening to the conversation, recognized an opportunity to provide additional reassurance. Your Highness, in all my years of protecting the royal family, I've seen many ceremonies where small mistakes happened. The sword was dropped once, words were forgotten, and someone even tripped on the steps. But you know what everyone remembered. Lewis shook his head, waiting for the answer. They remembered how gracefully the royal family handled those moments, and how it made them seem more human and relatable. The minor mistakes actually made people love them more, not less. This story seemed to have a profound impact on Lewis. The idea that mistakes might actually make people like him more, rather than less, was completely contrary to everything he had been telling himself. Outside on the platform, the assembled officials and media continued to wait patiently. Sir Robert MacLeod had sent word through the proper channels that the royal family was taking a few additional minutes to prepare, and the crowd had settled into patient anticipation. The honor guard maintained their positions with professional discipline, while photographers prepared their equipment and dignitaries reviewed their greeting protocols. The slight delay was unusual but not unprecedented, and everyone understood that royal schedules sometimes required flexibility. Back in the train, Lewis was beginning to show signs of calming down. His breathing had steadied, and the tight grip he had maintained on his mother's hand was starting to relax. "Do you think," he asked hesitantly, "that I could practice my words one more time before we get off the train?" "Of course," Catherine said warmly. "Would you like Papa and me to listen, or would you prefer to practice quietly to yourself?" "Could you listen?" Lewis asked. "And maybe tell me if I get anything wrong?" William moved closer to his son, creating an intimate circle where Lewis could practice without the pressure of outside observers. "We're ready whenever you are." Lewis straightened slightly, taking a deep breath before beginning the traditional words he had memorized for tomorrow's ceremony. His voice was quiet but clear as he recited the ancient Scottish phrases that would formally mark his participation in the heritage ceremony. "I, Lewis Arthur Charles of Cambridge, do solemnly promise to honor the traditions of Scotland and to carry forward the sacred bond between the royal house and the Scottish people in service and in truth." He completed the recitation without error, his confidence growing with each word. When he finished, both his parents smiled proudly. "That was perfect, Lewis," Catherine said warmly. "You have every single word exactly right. And your pronunciation of the Scottish phrases was excellent," William added. "You've been practicing very hard." For the first time since the journey began, Lewis smiled. The combination of successfully completing his practice and receiving his parents' praise seemed to restore some of his confidence. Inspector Matthews, observing the positive change in the young prince's demeanor, felt relief wash over her. The security concerns that had worried her earlier were dissolving as Lewis regained his emotional equilibrium. "Your Highness," she said gently, "if you're feeling ready, the officials on the platform are very excited to welcome you to Edinburgh." Lewis looked toward the window, where he could see the waiting crowd. The view that had terrified him earlier now seemed less threatening. The people waiting outside were there to support him, not to judge him harshly for any mistakes he might make. "I think I'm ready now," he said quietly, though his voice carried newfound determination. Catherine helped him straighten his formal travel clothes and checked that his hair was neat. The simple acts of preparation seemed to further restore his confidence and sense of purpose. "Remember," William said as they prepared to disembark, "if you start to feel overwhelmed at any point, just look for me or Mama. We'll be right there with you." Lewis nodded, appreciating the reassurance that he wouldn't be facing the challenges alone. The support of his family felt like armor against his fears. Commander Harrison spoke quietly into his radio, informing the platform officials that the royal family was ready to begin the welcome ceremony. The smooth coordination between security personnel and protocol officers ensured that the transition would be seamless. Lady Margaret Thornton took her position near the carriage door, ready to guide the family through the formal greetings and introductions that would follow their emergence onto the platform. As the train door opened, the sound of the assembled crowd reached them for the first time. There was applause, but it was warm and welcoming rather than demanding. The Scottish officials stood ready with genuine smiles of greeting. Lewis took his mother's hand as they prepared to step onto the platform. His grip was firm but no longer desperate, and his breathing remained steady. The transformation from the terrified child of an hour ago to the composed young prince ready to fulfill his duties was remarkable. "Are you ready, sweetheart?" Catherine asked quietly. "Yes, Mama," Lewis replied, and for the first time since the journey began, he truly meant it. They stepped together onto the red carpet that awaited them on the platform. The crowd's welcoming cheers provided a warm backdrop as the royal family began the formal greetings with Scottish officials. Sir Robert MacLeod stepped forward with a practiced bow and a genuine smile. "Your Royal Highnesses, welcome to Edinburgh. We are honored by your presence." Lewis watched his parents handle the formal greetings with practiced grace, and when his turn came to be introduced, he managed a polite bow and a quiet, "Thank you for having us," that earned approving nods from the assembled officials. The photographer's cameras captured the moment, but instead of the intrusive flashing that Lewis had imagined, the documentation seemed respectful and unobtrusive. The reality of the media attention was far less overwhelming than his fears had suggested. As they moved through the reception line, Lewis found himself actually enjoying some of the interactions. An elderly Scottish gentleman told him about the history of the station, and a local official's wife complimented his pronunciation of the Gaelic greeting he had learned for the occasion. These personal connections began to overshadow his anxiety about tomorrow's ceremony. The people he was meeting were individuals with their own stories and kindness, not the faceless mass of judgment he had imagined. The walk from the platform to the waiting royal cars gave Lewis a chance to see more of the crowd that had gathered to welcome them. Children waved enthusiastically from behind barriers, and many adults smiled warmly as the royal family passed. One little girl, about Lewis's age, caught his attention as she held up a handmade sign that read, "Welcome Prince Louis." Her obvious excitement and genuine pleasure at seeing him helped Lewis understand that his presence brought joy to others, rather than creating opportunities for criticism. As they settled into the royal car for the journey to their Edinburgh accommodation, Lewis felt significantly different than he had when they arrived. The fears that had seemed so overwhelming on the train now felt manageable, and his understanding of tomorrow's ceremony had shifted dramatically. That wasn't so scary after all, he admitted to his parents as their car pulled away from the station. "No, it wasn't," Catherine agreed. "And tomorrow's ceremony will be even better because you'll be surrounded by people who care about you and want you to succeed." Through the car window, Lewis watched the ancient city of Edinburgh pass by. The castle on the hill looked impressive, but no longer frightening. Tomorrow, he would walk across that courtyard and participate in a ceremony that connected him to centuries of tradition. But now he understood that the tradition was about belonging and service, not about perfection and judgment. The people who would watch him tomorrow would be cheering for him, not waiting for him to fail. The remainder of the journey to their accommodation passed in comfortable conversation about the sights of Edinburgh and the history they would be celebrating. Lewis asked questions about the castle and the ceremony, his natural curiosity returning as his fears receded. Inspector Matthews, riding in the security vehicle behind them, noted in her log that the situation had been successfully resolved through family support and patience. The young prince's emotional crisis had been handled with wisdom and care, preventing what could have been a serious security concern. As their convoy approached the historic hotel where they would stay before tomorrow's ceremony, Lewis felt a sense of anticipation that was entirely different from the dread that had consumed him earlier. He was still nervous about the formal ceremony, but the nervousness now felt normal and manageable rather than overwhelming. The day had taught him that fears could be faced and overcome with the support of family and the understanding that others wanted him to succeed. Tomorrow's ceremony would be a celebration, not a test, and he was finally ready to participate with confidence and joy. The morning mist hung heavy over the Scottish Highlands as the royal train made its way through the rolling countryside. Inside the luxury carriages, the usual bustle of a royal journey was in full swing. Staff members moved efficiently between compartments, preparing for the day's scheduled events at Edinburgh Castle. Detective Inspector Sarah Matthews of the Royal Protection Unit checked her watch for the third time in 10 minutes. Something felt different about this journey, though she couldn't pinpoint exactly what. The 8-year-old Prince Louis had been unusually quiet since boarding the train at King's Cross Station the previous evening. Unlike his typical animated chatter and endless questions about everything from train engines to castle dungeons, he had barely spoken during breakfast. The train's head of security, Commander James Harrison, noticed the detective's concerned expression as he approached her position near the dining car. His 30 years of protecting the royal family had taught him to read the subtle signs when something wasn't quite right. "Everything secure, Inspector?" Harrison asked, his voice carrying the practiced calm that came with decades of high-stakes responsibility. "The perimeter is clear, sir," Matthews replied, though her eyes continued scanning the corridor. "But Prince Louis seems unusually withdrawn this morning. He barely touched his breakfast and hasn't asked a single question about the journey." Harrison nodded thoughtfully. The young prince was known throughout the protection detail for his insatiable curiosity. During previous royal tours, he would pepper the guards with questions about their equipment, the train's mechanics, and the history of every castle and landmark they passed. This silence was indeed unusual. In the royal family's private carriage, Princess Catherine sat across from her youngest son, watching him stare out the window at the passing landscape. The rolling green hills and ancient stone walls of Scotland stretched endlessly beyond the glass, but Louis seemed to see none of it. His small hands were clasped tightly in his lap, and she noticed the slight tremor that ran through them when he thought no one was looking. "Louis, darling," Catherine said gently, "would you like to play one of our word games? We could spot different animals in the fields." The boy shook his head without turning away from the window. "No, thank you, Mama." His voice was barely above a whisper, so different from his usual enthusiastic responses. Catherine exchanged a worried glance with Prince William, who was reviewing the day's itinerary on his tablet. They had both noticed their son's change in behavior over the past few days, but attributed it to the excitement and pressure of the upcoming royal engagements. The train's rhythm created a soothing backdrop as it clicked along the tracks, but inside the royal carriage, tension was building. Louis had always been the most spirited of their children, full of energy and mischief. To see him so subdued was deeply troubling for his parents. "Perhaps he's just tired from the journey," William suggested, though concern was evident in his voice. "It has been a long trip, and tomorrow's ceremony will be quite formal." Catherine wasn't convinced. A mother's instinct told her this was more than simple fatigue. She had seen Louis handle much longer journeys and more demanding schedules without this level of withdrawal. Something was weighing heavily on their youngest son's mind. As the train rounded a curve, the ancient towers of Edinburgh Castle came into view in the distance. The site of the historic fortress, perched dramatically on its rocky outcrop, usually would have had Louis pressed against the window, asking excited questions about battles and knights. Instead, he seemed to shrink further into his seat. The castle represented not just a destination, but the culmination of months of planning for a significant royal ceremony. Prince Louis was scheduled to participate in a traditional Scottish ceremony honoring young members of the royal family. The event would be attended by hundreds of dignitaries, media representatives, and members of the public. For an 8-year-old, the pressure of such formal occasions could be overwhelming. In the staff compartment, Lady Margaret Thornton, the children's private secretary, reviewed the detailed schedule one final time. Every minute of the next 2 days was carefully planned, from the arrival ceremony at Edinburgh Castle to the formal dinner with Scottish nobility. She had worked with the royal children for several years and understood the unique pressures they faced. The young prince seems rather quiet today, she mentioned to Harrison during their security briefing. We've all noticed, Harrison replied. Inspector Matthews is keeping a close eye on the situation. Sometimes the anticipation of major events affects the children differently. Lady Margaret nodded, remembering previous occasions when the pressure of public appearances had overwhelmed young royals. The expectation to behave perfectly, to represent the crown with dignity, and to handle intense public scrutiny was enormous for anyone, let alone a child. Back in the royal carriage, Louis finally spoke, his voice so quiet that his parents had to lean forward to hear him. Do I really have to do the ceremony tomorrow? He asked, still staring out the window. Catherine's heart clenched at the vulnerability in her son's voice. What's troubling you about it, sweetheart? For a moment, it seemed as though Louis might open up about whatever was bothering him. His lips parted slightly, and he turned toward his mother with wide, uncertain eyes. But then, he seemed to retreat again, shaking his head and returning his gaze to the window. I just don't want to, he whispered. William set down his tablet and moved to sit beside his son. Louis, you know we're here to help you with anything that's worrying you. You can tell us anything. The boy's shoulders tensed, and, for a brief moment, his parents thought they might finally learn what was troubling him. But, instead, Louis stood abruptly and moved toward the small private washroom at the rear of the carriage. I need to use the loo, he said quietly, closing the door behind him. Catherine and William exchanged concerned glances. Their son's behavior was becoming increasingly worrying, and they felt helpless to reach him. The private moment in the washroom seemed to stretch on longer than necessary, adding to their growing anxiety. Outside in the corridor, Inspector Matthews noticed the young prince's movement through the carriage. As part of the protection protocol, she maintained awareness of all royal family members' locations at all times. When Louis remained in the washroom for several minutes longer than typical, she began to pay closer attention. The train continued its steady progress through the Scottish countryside, passing through small villages where curious onlookers had gathered along the tracks. Word of the royal train's passage had spread, and people waved enthusiastically from platforms and fields, hoping for a glimpse of the royal family. Inside the washroom, Louis sat on the closed toilet seat, his small frame shaking with silent sobs. The weight of expectation, the fear of making a mistake in front of hundreds of people, and the pressure to represent his family perfectly had become overwhelming. At 8 years old, he felt trapped by circumstances beyond his understanding or control. The ceremony tomorrow would require him to walk alone across a large courtyard while hundreds of people watched, and cameras recorded his every step. He would need to receive a ceremonial sword from the Scottish Lord Chamberlain and recite traditional words in front of the gathered crowd. The thought of all those eyes watching him, judging his every movement, filled him with paralyzing fear. He had practiced the ceremony countless times with his tutors and family, but the reality of performing it in public felt impossibly daunting. What if he forgot his words? What if he tripped or dropped the ceremonial sword? What if he embarrassed his entire family in front of the world? These thoughts circled endlessly in his young mind as he sat in the small washroom, feeling more alone than ever despite being surrounded by family and protection officers. The train's movement seemed to rock his fears back and forth, amplifying them with each passing mile that brought them closer to Edinburgh. Meanwhile, in the royal carriage, Catherine and William's concern deepened with each passing minute. They could hear the faint sound of sniffling from behind the washroom door, confirming their worst fears that their son was crying. Should we go to him? Catherine whispered to her husband. Let's give him another moment, William replied, though every instinct told him to comfort his distressed child. Sometimes children need a private space to process their emotions. But, as the minutes stretched on, both parents struggled with the decision of whether to intervene or allow their son the privacy he seemed to need. Inspector Matthews, monitoring the situation from the corridor, made note of the extended time in her security log. While not immediately alarming, any deviation from normal patterns required documentation. Her training had taught her to observe and assess without immediately intervening, unless clear danger was present. The train began to slow as it approached the outskirts of Edinburgh. The ancient city spread before them, with Edinburgh Castle dominating the skyline. The sight of their destination seemed to bring a sense of finality to the journey, and, with it, increased anxiety about the approaching ceremony. Lady Margaret Thornton appeared in the corridor, tablet in hand, ready to brief the family on the arrival procedures. She noticed Inspector Matthews' focused attention on the royal carriage and the closed washroom door. "Is everything proceeding normally?" she asked quietly. "Prince Louis has been in the washroom for nearly 10 minutes, Matthews replied. "The family seems concerned about his emotional state." Lady Margaret frowned. In her experience, extended bathroom visits often indicated distress rather than physical need, especially with children facing high-pressure situations. Inside the washroom, Louis wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and tried to compose himself. He knew he couldn't stay hidden forever, but the thought of facing his parents' concerned questions felt almost as daunting as the ceremony itself. How could he explain that he felt like he was drowning in expectations he didn't understand? The train's whistle echoed across the Scottish countryside as they approached Edinburgh Waverley Station. The sound seemed to emphasize the inevitability of what lay ahead, the ceremony that felt like a mountain he couldn't climb. Taking a shaky breath, Louis unlocked the washroom door and slowly opened it. His parents looked up immediately, their faces reflecting a mixture of relief and concern. His red-rimmed eyes and pale complexion told them everything they needed to know about his emotional state. "Oh, sweetheart," Catherine said softly, opening her arms to welcome him back. But instead of seeking comfort in his mother's embrace, Louis surprised everyone by walking quickly past them toward the rear exit of the carriage. His sudden movement caught Inspector Matthews' attention immediately, and she began to move toward the royal carriage. "Louis, where are you going?" William called after him, rising from his seat. "I need some air," Louis replied, his voice thick with emotion. The train's rear carriage led to a small observation platform that was typically used by staff for maintenance access. It wasn't designed as a passenger area, and strict security protocols governed access to all external areas of the royal train. Inspector Matthews quickened her pace as she realized Prince Louis was heading toward an unauthorized area. Her training kicked in automatically, prioritizing the young prince's safety above all other considerations. "Your Highness," she called gently but firmly, "please step away from that door." Louis paused at the heavy metal door leading to the observation platform. His small hand rested on the handle as he looked back at the approaching inspector. For a moment, their eyes met, and Matthews saw the depth of distress in the 8-year-old's gaze. "I just want to be alone," Louis said, his voice barely audible above the train's movement. "I understand that feeling," Matthews replied, approaching slowly and calmly. "But that door leads to an unsafe area. Let's find somewhere else where you can have some quiet time." Behind them, Catherine and William had followed their son, maintaining a respectful distance while staying close enough to intervene if necessary. The entire situation had escalated quickly from concern to potential security risk. Commander Harrison's voice crackled through Matthew's radio earpiece, having been alerted to the situation by the train's monitoring systems. "Status report, Inspector. Prince Louis is at the rear access door," she replied quietly into her radio. "Situation is under control, but emotional distress is evident." The train began to decelerate more noticeably as Edinburgh Waverley Station approached. Through the windows, they could see the platform preparations underway for the royal arrival. Security personnel were positioning themselves, and a small crowd of media and well-wishers had gathered despite the early hour. Louis looked out at the approaching station and felt his chest tighten further. The sight of the cameras and crowds waiting for their arrival made the reality of tomorrow's ceremony even more overwhelming. All those people would be watching him, expecting him to perform perfectly. "I can't do it," he whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. Inspector Matthews heard the quiet words and felt her heart go out to the distressed child. Her own daughter was close to Louis's age, and she understood the overwhelming nature of adult expectations on young shoulders. "Your Highness," she said gently, "would you like to sit down and talk about what's worrying you?" Louis shook his head, his grip tightening on the door handle. The metal was cool under his palm, and, for a moment, he imagined simply opening it and stepping out into the rushing air, leaving all his fears and expectations behind. Catherine couldn't stand back any longer. Moving slowly and speaking in the soothing voice she used during nighttime fears and childhood uncertainties, she approached her son. "Louis, my darling, please come and sit with me. We don't have to talk about anything you don't want to discuss." For a moment, the boy wavered. The love in his mother's voice was comforting, but the weight of disappointment he feared he might cause felt heavier than any comfort she could offer. The train's brakes engaged more forcefully as they entered the station approach, and the change in movement seemed to break the spell that had held Louis frozen at the door. He released the handle and turned toward his family, tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry," he sobbed, finally, allowing his mother to gather him into her arms. "I'm sorry I'm such a disappointment." Catherine held him tightly, her own eyes filling with tears at her son's words. "You could never be a disappointment to us, sweetheart. Never." William joined them, wrapping both his wife and son in his embrace. Inspector Matthews stepped back respectfully, though she remained alert and ready to intervene if necessary. The immediate security concern had passed, but the underlying issue remained unresolved. As the royal train came to a complete stop at Edinburgh Waverley Station, the family remained locked in their embrace in the rear of the carriage. Outside, the ceremony of arrival was beginning, but, inside, a more important drama was unfolding. The weight of royal duty, the pressure of public expectation, and the simple fears of a child had collided in this moment. What happened next would determine not just the success of tomorrow's ceremony, but the emotional well-being of a young prince struggling to understand his place in a world of ancient traditions and modern scrutiny. The station platform bustled with activity as officials prepared for the royal family's emergence from the train. But, for now, in the quiet privacy of the rear carriage, the most important ceremony was the one taking place between parents and child, as they began to address fears that had grown too large for an 8-year-old heart to carry alone.